Hey everybody, Austin here again. Today we're going to be talking about the Sega Saturn. This is a kind of video I haven't actually done in quite some time now. I think since my FM Towns Marty talking about video, which was quite a while ago. But I just got the urge to do another one of these types of videos, and maybe we'll actually see this as a regular addition to my channel once again. So if you guys like this sort of thing, let me know, and I'll cover more of these systems that I have. But this is the old Sega Saturn. It came out in late 1994 in Japan and mid-1995 in North America. What we have here is actually the Model 2 version. It looks very much like the Model 1, same shape and size and whatnot. However, the way you can tell the difference between the Model 2 and Model 1 is the power buttons, power and eject, sorry. On the Model 2, they are just simple circles. On the Model 1, they are sort of elliptical shaped or oval in a way. So, but pretty much the same thing otherwise, at least on the exterior. This is the, again, the console itself. It is a CD-based console, so you've got an eject button there, and that's the disk drive and the disk tray right there. And you can actually see through it as well, and you can see the disc spinning in case you're ever wondering as you're playing. But yes, you have the power and reset buttons on the front. You also have an LED that lets you know that the system is on. You have a cartridge slot on the back, and what this is good for is for memory expansion as well as backup saving. So the Saturn does have internal memory, so you can save a certain amount of game files to the internal memory. And then if you have a memory cartridge, you can plug it in and then back up your saves to that cartridge. I highly recommend doing that because there is a battery that actually helps store that information, and this battery will actually die pretty frequently. Mine is currently dead. I don't bother replacing it. I just back up all my data to the slot or the cartridge slot. So what this slot is right here, this door actually also acts as an expansion slot. So there are, say, MPEG decoders you can get that will work with certain games, and yeah. On the back here, you do have a power plug. It uses the exact same kind of plug as the Sony PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast. You also have another expansion or communications port right here, which you can use for system linking. Not many games actually take advantage of that. And then you have a AV port right here. And you'll notice that it looks very similar to the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive Model 2. It is a totally different type of pinout. So you cannot use Sega Saturn cables on a Genesis or Genesis cables on a Sega Saturn, and so on and so forth. So the Sega Saturn does support composite RF S-video, and it also does RGB out of the box for those of you guys that live in Europe, or for those of you guys that like to do upscaling with RGB. The Sega Saturn does support it out of the box. No need to modify the console. And yeah, that is the Sega Saturn system by itself, the Model 2. Now, the Sega Saturn had a variety of controllers that you could use, and I'll show off a couple of more later on in the video, but the Model 2 that I have comes with this Model 2 controller. It's a really fantastic controller. You've got these nice clicky L and R buttons, really nice face button layout. The buttons are nice and solid and responsive. Likewise with the D-pad, it's a really good floating D-pad, one of the best D-pads ever made. The Saturn, it really excels at two-dimensional games in particular, and this is one of the best controllers for those types of games. And of course, you got your start button in the middle, and this is the backhand side right here. And this is your Sega Saturn plug. So this is what it looks like going into the front of the console, so on and so forth. I really like the design of the Sega Saturn's controllers. There is a Model 1 controller, which is a little more goofy looking, but I also find it to be fairly comfortable, and it's still a solid controller as well. These are the default controllers you would get with Japanese systems. For instance, we have a standard controller for the Japanese market. Japanese Sega Saturn systems and controllers and accessories were usually different colors from the North American market. The North American market was black, whereas the Japanese ones could come in a variety of colors, like this sort of solid gray, white, so on and so forth. And there are other options as well, depending on the kind of console bundle that you get. But otherwise, the controllers are pretty much the same, and they both are functionally identical. So, but really fantastic controllers. One of my favorite, actually, game console controllers of all time for two-dimensional games. Obviously, there are no analog sticks on here, but that was actually an issue that was solved later on. We'll talk about later. Now, if you're into collecting real hardware, including the boxes and everything, this is what you would get if you bought yourself a complete in-box Model 2 Sega Saturn. Now, the Model 1 Sega Saturn box is ginormous. It is just absolutely massive. It's one of the longest retro game console boxes out there. I prefer the Model 2, for one, just the looks of the base console itself. I prefer, it was also the one I had back in the late 90s when I actually got a Sega Saturn when they were current on the market. Also, the box is a lot smaller. It's a lot easier to store. So if you're, if you're collecting real hardware like I like to do, boxed and everything, these systems can take up lots of space extremely quickly. But this is what you would get on the inside of it. This is what the inside of the Model 2 box looks like. Nothing too terribly special here. We have ourselves an instruction manual. I don't have everything with this, but the instruction manual is right here, as you can see, just like so. And I have some other material on the inside. And the flap just comes on up like this. And look, oh, that's where my Action Replay boxes went. I wonder where they were. I'm going to actually take one out. But yes, it has this cardboard tray in the middle. You'll also get some Sega Saturn stickers. There's a bootleg sampler disc. And this specific type, the Model 2 Sega Saturn, I'm pretty sure most of them, if not all of them, came with a Nights into Dreams demo disc. And so if you ever see the Nights into Dreams demo disc, it came with this console bundle right here. The Model 2 systems, for a period of time, also came with the Sega 3-pack, which is why you see games like Virtua Cop, Daytona USA, and Virtua Fighter 2 around so frequently, because they also came bundled with this. It was a special deal Sega had run back in the late 90s to try to catch up to its competitors, but it failed miserably. Unfortunately, it failed miserably. Still a great system. If you had it back in the 90s, you were probably really happy with it. I was anyway. And, I did get some free games with it. So you can actually see here, video game sampler enclosed, and that's for the bootleg sampler. I think it was bootleg sampler volume 2, actually. The original Saturn came with another bootleg sampler. Here's the back of the console box. Nothing too special here. Just kind of like folds in together like so. Here's one side right there. And here's another side, showing off a bunch of actually really good games. We got Guardian Heroes there. We got Virtua Fighter 2, Knights, Tomb Raider. Really excellent stuff. So yeah, pretty basic stuff here. And that is the Model 2 system box for the North American market. Now, if you're the kind of person that likes to buy real physical Saturn games, these are the types of cases that we got in North America. It was very much just like Sega CD cases, basically the same thing. It's these big CD-style jewel cases that are just oversized. You just open them up to reveal the disc in there. They actually came with foam pads, so if you ever buy Sega Saturn games and you see these foam pads, these are normal. These actually help keep the disc from rattling in case it comes loose from the spindle. And it coming loose from the spindle is very common, so having these pads is actually really nice. You got these full-size instruction manuals. You've got a very consistent spine from game to game, so that's Doom. And here we go, we've got Virtua Cop. Very much the same kind of design and whatnot. Now, earlier games on the system actually didn't have full-size art. Now, this is not an earlier game on the system. This is actually a later game, but you'll notice that it actually comes up and it's just striped on the top. Now, if we take Scorcher, which was also a later release game, its art actually goes fully up and down. These cases are very brittle as well. As you can see, Scorcher is just a wreck. Scorcher is a fairly cheap game, at least as of doing this video, and so what I did is I had another game that was worth more money, and I swapped out Scorcher's nice case for the cruddy case that came with the more expensive game. So a lot of games would also feature advertising material on the backs of the manuals, so you'd open it up and you could see advertisements for Fighting Vipers and Virtual On. Both amazing games for the system, some of my favorites. So yeah, this is what you would get with buying games in the North American region. Now, if you like to import Saturn games, this is what the Japanese games look like. You'll notice that it's a totally different art style on the packaging. So we got this gold trim right here, and you'll notice there is a black Saturn logo on the far left, just like so. And most Japanese games would have these black bars on the bottom, giving you extra information about the game and all sorts of stuff. Now, a lot of Japanese games would also come with what's called OBI strips or spine cards. Unfortunately, I don't have any spine cards for these two games right here, but something to watch out for if you are collecting Sega Saturn games. Now, the Sega Saturn was also released in Europe, and Europe actually has some interesting cases compared to other regions. So what we have here is actually Exhumed, aka Power Slave in North America, and we just open up the case. The manual has just flopped right over. We just drop it back like that, and look, my disc actually came loose. I had no idea. So you think the North American cases spindles are a little iffy, the European ones are even worse. And there's actually really no place to put foam on these either, so, you know, if they come loose, they're just going around and scraping about. But yeah, very thick manuals. I think a lot of the manuals had multi-languages. It was very common during this generation, not only with the Sega Saturn, but other systems like the Jaguar did the same thing, did multi-language manuals. But yeah, it just snaps shut like that. It's got, this is what the side looks like. And Doom here is actually the exact same way. So there we go. Now the artwork here is, unfortunately, I guess it's glued to the case itself. And what I found is that these have a tendency of lifting up. So if you're collecting, it's probably a little more difficult to find these in really excellent condition. But again, there it is. And my disc is actually coming loose, just like with Exhumed. And so that's Doom. Not a great version of Doom. And here we have an interesting one. This is Quake, and I assume this is legit. I don't live in Europe, but this is a plastic case with a insert that goes inside, kind of like DVD cases, things like that. So, but there we go. Yeah, this has to be legit because it does have the Sega logo right there. So very interesting, and it's a Sega Saturn. I would prefer this kind of case, although because of the you know, the cover here, it just, the artwork does look a lot more muted as a result. Whereas the colors on these cases, just, they pop. It's very vibrant. But again, you do have the issue of, you know, the label lifting up, kind of like old Atari cartridges. So just like every other console on the market, pretty much ever, the Sega Saturn actually has a lot of extra accessories you can buy. Controllers, expansions, things like that. This one right here is probably one of the best ones you can get. This is an actual first-party controller. It is the Sega 3D control pad. It actually came out when Knights released, and it has an analog stick up here. Not a huge fan of the analog stick, but it does allow analog control with a thumbstick on many, many games. The face buttons are actually really nice on this, and the D-pad, just like the Model 2 D-pad, is fantastic. It's also got a start button right here. Now, it's also got a switch down here in the center, and what this does is it basically switches between digital and analog controls. Some games will need to be in the analog position when you turn the system on. It will not work when you switch it mid-game, so just for certain games, remember to keep that on. You'll need to find a list online of games that support this, but basically, any games that supported the analog for, say, the racing wheel or the flight stick and so on and so forth should work as long as this switch is in the right direction. It might not work with every game that supports those, but you need to find a list online and experiment. But really fantastic controller. It's got analog triggers on the sides here. And this is sort of the precursor to the Dreamcast controller, which is another favorite controller of mine. And it's actually bulky, but it actually feels really comfortable in the hands. And there are periods of time where I'll only use the 3D control pad just because it is really comfortable, really good controller. I do highly recommend this as a backup or just for something to play around with when you get tired of the regular controller. Sega also released a Stunner, the Sega Stunner, the light gun for the Sega Saturn. It originally came bundled with Virtua Cop, and there were other bundles as well, like with Virtua Cop 2. And it's a really fantastic light gun. This light gun was praised quite a bit back in the day for, you know, within Sega Saturn, the Sega Saturn ownership circle, and it's just still a great gun to use today. It's my favorite way to play games like Virtua Cop and Virtua Cop 2, and it is a must-have accessory if you're a big fan of those games. Now, there is actually a third-party light gun as well. I actually don't know who makes this, but I found it locally at a used game store, and it's unbranded, but it actually works really, really well. So if you see one of these out in the wild, and if it's super cheap compared to, say, the Stunner, it's worth picking up too. It actually works very well, so definitely recommend that. If you're looking for third-party accessories in your Sega Saturn or replacement controllers, you might get fooled into buying one of these on eBay. They're usually very cheap. I think I got 2 of these together for probably $10 shipped. Very cheap and not worth it. Just don't mess with them. However, there are official third-party options now. This is the Retrobait controller. It's a replica of the Model 2 controller I showed off earlier. And aside from the triggers being different, everything else is pretty much identical. It's a really, really fantastic controller. You get a classic retro style box, officially licensed by Sega, and it's actually just a great, great controller. This cost me about $15. Actually, no, it looks like it was $20. You could probably get them cheaper online. I got it locally, so it always cost me more. But really excellent controller. If you're looking for a replacement but not buying an original, this is a great way to go. You will be very happy with this controller. Sega actually also released a mouse for the system, as you can see here. It's very similar to the Genesis mouse, and you could use this with a variety of games on the Sega Saturn. Some games are basically best played with the mouse. Kind of an obscure accessory, not one that everyone goes for, but there are some games that support it. If I recall correctly, you could also use it with the Planet web browser back when you could use the Netlink, which was a dial-up modem that would attach to your console through the cartridge slot, and you could dial up to your ISP at the time, and then browse the internet, and you could use the mouse for that, I'm pretty sure. So since the Sega Saturn was an arcade-focused console, lots of accessories were released to sort of let you relive that arcade experience at your home or in your home. One of the accessories in North America is called the Ascii stick, or Ascii Saturn stick by Asciiware. And it's actually a stick with micro switches on the inside, which is very cool, and the buttons actually feel decent for what they are. And it's got a really nice hard base here. Very, very hard, nice. Metallic underside, also very hard. It doesn't feel cheap, although getting one of these shouldn't cost you very much. They're not really high in demand. A lot of hardcore players prefer some of the Japanese options, like the Japanese Virtua stick or other options by companies like Hori. Now this is the box itself. A lot of accessories like this will come in pretty hefty boxes, including Sega's own Virtua stick in North America. And this is the back of the Ascii Saturn stick. So while I can talk all day about accessories, I'm trying to limit this to basically what I have personally on hand, and I don't have every accessory. But one thing I have to talk about are memory card expansions that would go in the cartridge slot here. So what I have here is the Action Replay, and this is a fantastic cartridge. It's actually a multi-card. It serves multiple purposes. For one, it actually will let you back up your save file memory that I talked about internally from the console and transfer it to the cartridge itself as a backup. Really great for someone like me that has a dead battery and doesn't want to replace it because they die quickly. So what I do is I have the Saturn Action Replay in here. When I'm done with my session, I reset the console to go to the Action Replay menu, and then it has a file manager that'll let you access the internal memory and the Action Replay's memory. The Action Replay also has lots of other great features. It actually acts as a import converter, so it'll actually bypass the Saturn's region lockout completely. And so you can play European games in your North American console, you can play Japanese games in your North American console, you can play North American games in your Japanese console, and so on and so forth. Now, later on in the Saturn's life, games started using RAM cartridges. It basically expanded the memory of the console itself, so you could have, better animation, faster load times, things like that. The Action Replay has that built in, so games like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Metal Slug, stuff like that, Street Fighter 03 will require the RAM, and this is a great way to access that without using an original RAM card. The Action Replay also actually serves as a Game Shark as well, or Action Replay. In Europe, it was known as the Action Replay. It was a cheat device, so you can also access cheats and enable cheats with the Action Replay. There was a Game Shark that came out in North America. It was basically the same thing as the Action Replay. However, accessing the import functionality was a little bit different, and it didn't have the RAM built in for games like X-Men vs. Street Fighter. But this is a must-have device. if you're a Sega Saturn fan and you plan on getting some imports, even if you don't plan on getting some imports, this is still a very, very good device to have just for the backup memory support. I've been using these since the 1990s, and they have pretty much never failed me. It is a must-buy accessory if you're going to get into the Sega Saturn or already have a Sega Saturn but don't have one of these. So for those of you guys new to the Sega Saturn, what I'm going to do is actually talk about some of my favorite games on the system. Now, these aren't games that I might recommend you rush out and buy. Some of them might be duds for some people, but these are games that I really enjoy, and there are reasons why I really enjoy the Sega Saturn. Now, these are just a small pool of games, overall games on the console that I really enjoy. The Sega Saturn has an amazing library, especially if you get into Japanese imports. There's so many shoot-'em-ups on the system. It is one of the best consoles for that. And arcade style gaming. It's just really fantastic. But there are other non-arcade style games as well. RPGs, adventure games, sim games, all sorts of stuff. Quite a wide variety of games on the platform. So starting off here is actually Panzer Dragoon. This is a very much beloved rail shooter on the system. So think games like Star Fox. What sets Panzer Dragoon apart from the other games is, for one, the visual style and the soundtrack, but also the gameplay lets you rotate your camera angle 360 degrees. So not only can you aim straight forward and move up and down to dodge bullets, but you can also turn around and shoot at enemies behind you. The graphic style in this game, while the first Panzer Dragoon hasn't aged the best visually because of a low frame rate and whatnot, still has a very unique graphic style, shows off what the Saturn was able to do in its early days, and the game is quite fun with its lock-on functionality and whatnot. It's also not a very long game. It's got 7 or 8 stages in it. It never overstays its welcome. It does get a little difficult towards the end, but it's just awesome. It's really, really fun. The sequel is even better. Unfortunately, I don't have access to it right now, so I can't show you any footage of it. Next up, we have Radiant Silvergun. Now, this is one of my favorite shooters of all time, and the Saturn is just a beast of a shooter console. It's one of the best consoles ever for this genre, with such a wide variety, and Radiant Silvergun is a great demonstration of this. Great graphics, mixing 2D backdrops with 3D polygonal objects. It's one of the few games to mesh that style very elegantly. The game is very unique, where you have to level up your weapons to get more powerful. Getting more points levels your weapons up faster. Very unique gameplay style that doesn't really click with everyone at first, but it is the sheer definition of a grower, a game that will just grow on you the more and more you play it. As such, it's actually become one of my favorites of all time, and I still go back to it via the Xbox 360 version, which I also highly recommend if you don't have access to a Sega Saturn. Radiant Silvergun is on that. Next up is Darius Gaiden, a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up. Now, Taito actually released a lot of their arcade shoot-'em-ups to the Sega Saturn at the time, and Darius Gaiden is just one of those that has held up so nicely over the years. It's just a beautiful looking 2D game, really showing off what the Sega Saturn can do with 2D stuff. Still a great game to play, very, very challenging. One of my favorites to go back to. The soundtrack, the graphics, the gameplay is super tight. It is excellent. One of my favorite things about the Sega Saturn are Sega's arcade ports. Virtua Cop is one of my favorites on the system. I always go back to it. Sega Rally is just an excellent conversion. Plays very, very well. Sounds great. Runs great. Very, very fun game. Daytona USA, a lot of people think this isn't a very good version of the game, and I can see where a lot of them are coming from, but ultimately it just plays really well. It's a really, really fun game, and it is super cheap, one of the cheapest games you can get on the console because it was included in Sega's 3 free games bundle. Sega also has a lot of their super scalar games featured on the console as well. My favorite is obviously OutRun. I always go back to this game. This is available on the Sega Ages compilation, brought over by Working Designs, which also includes Afterburner 2, as well as Space Harrier, but OutRun is the one I like to go back to the most. Really fantastic. Saturn's also really good for one of my favorite things, which is pinball video games. It's got the original Pro Pinball, it's got True Pinball, it's got Fantastic Pinball in Japan, and then it's got 2 of my favorites of all time, which is Necronomicon and Last Gladiators Pinball, which you see here. Now, what's really special about these games is that they're some of the few games on the console to use the Sega Saturn's high-resolution mode for the entire game. A lot of Sega Saturn games would have the high-res mode on their title screens, but not in the game itself. Necronomicon and Last Gladiators feature it for the entire game, and they just look incredible even today. The Sega Saturn was also king for fighting games. It was the fighting game platform of the time. If anyone imported the Saturn back in the 90s, it was because of its fighting games and its shoot-'em-ups, but Mostly it's fighting games. X-Men versus Street Fighter, Marvel versus Street Fighter, stuff like that, which is very popular on the console import scene back in the day. Now, some of my personal favorites are Street Fighter 03, which unfortunately is a super expensive game, but with other means you can play it pretty easily. Just looks fantastic. It takes advantage of the RAM cartridge, and it's just incredible. Now, I also have a soft spot for some of the Western fighting games as well, like Mortal Kombat Trilogy, which was a solid conversion of the game, as well as Primal Rage. Primal Rage was a personal favorite in the arcade. The Sega Saturn actually has one of the best versions you can get from the 1990s, outside of the MS-DOS PC version, which was the best. Another personal favorite of mine is Scorcher. Now, this is one you don't hear people talk about too often, for good reason. It is a bit of an acquired taste. The frame rate can chug. There's a huge learning curve in this game, but it's one of those kinds of games where once you get a handle on it and you learn the tracks, you learn the mechanics, it's one of the most exhilarating racing experiences you could ever have. So it's one of those games I go back to pretty frequently whenever I fire up my Saturn. One of my other favorite games on the system is something that some of you guys might not actually expect, and that is a strategy RPG called Dragon Force. And this was created by Sega in Japan and translated and brought over to North America by Working Designs. And Working Designs just did an excellent job on this game. And the game is just super polished. It's super fun. It's not like a typical Japanese RPG. It's more about going and trying to take over castles. And when you do that, you'll actually go into a battle sequence, and you have different troops that are good against other troops or bad against other troops, and there's a rock, paper, scissors sort of gameplay setup going on here. It's really difficult to describe in just a couple of minutes like this, but the game looks great. It's got an amazing soundtrack. It's very unique gameplay-wise, and it's actually very easy to get into. I don't play a lot of role-playing games, especially from this era, but I was able to get sucked into the game and actually beat the game multiple times. It's really fantastic, and I highly recommend checking it out. So with that out of the way, let's actually talk about the elephant in the room. And unfortunately, the Sega Saturn has shot up in price considerably since the 90s and early 2000s. I was there in the 90s when games were being liquidated for $10 a pop, and afterwards where you could get games for $2 or $3 brand new sealed. So I got to experience most of the library at a very affordable price. Now, people these days will have it the exact opposite. Games have really shot up. Even the most common US titles have gone up in price significantly. Now, fortunately, there are ways around that if you are okay with them. For one, you can actually end up modding the console with a mod chip or flash an action replay, which will allow you to read CDRs in the disk drive. And I actually highly recommend looking into doing that. There are also devices called optical drive emulators, which will replace your disk drive. It's very easy to open the console and just remove the disk drive. It's a very simple process, and these devices will allow you to replace the disk drive with an SD card reader, and then you can load up ISOs to the SD card and have the system read them as if they were original discs. So if you're looking to get into Sega Saturn and not really pay a whole lot, I would highly recommend looking into flashing an action replay and burning some discs, or buying yourself an optical drive emulator and installing it. The optical drive emulators will sell anywhere from $100 to $200. But they are worth it considering all the money you'll save in not having to buy games. Now, if you're just Mr. Moneybags and you've got all the money in the world, eBay, used game stores, games are out there. If you're looking for a cheaper physical option, get yourself an action replay and then buy the Japanese versions of North American releases. So pretty much all of your arcade games, you can buy the Japanese versions. You'll be fine. They're not very English heavy. Your role-playing games, unfortunately, they are very English heavy, and unless you speak Japanese, they're not going to be very good buys. So yeah, the RPGs in particular have really shot up in price. Shining Force 3, Dragon Force, Shining Wisdom, stuff like that. Magic Knight Rayearth, although that's more of an action adventure. Panzer Dragoon Saga is the holy grail. So yeah, Sega Saturn, I highly recommend getting into the system regardless of how you have to do it. There are still affordable games, especially some hidden gems like Scorcher that I had mentioned. Some might be acquired tastes, but you can still get into the console relatively cheap. Systems themselves aren't that expensive. You can probably still get them for under $100 after doing this, as of doing this video. Yeah, look for some of those Japanese versions of North American games, and I think you'll be good. Or just keep a a keen eye out on places like eBay. Check out some local game stores if you have any that sell retro product, and you might be able to get some good deals on some Saturn games and have a good time. So, but yeah, that is the Sega Saturn. There are other things I could talk about, but I don't think it's really necessary. You know, there's a lot of comparisons out on the internet between the Saturn to the PS1 and how it handles 3D and stuff like that, and that's just been done to death. Regardless of its differences, you know, to the PlayStation, it is just still a fantastic console. Its 3D was fine, its 2D was amazing, and it's got just some really nice features that are just awesome. I love being able to back up data to the cartridge and so on and so forth. The easy ways of playing import games, and so on and so forth. It's just such a good experience. I love the Sega Saturn. I've always loved it. I had one when it was brand new, and I still love it to this day. And I'm actually looking forward to getting my own optical drive emulator sometime soon, so we can actually cover more Saturn games on my channel. But that is the Sega Saturn for you guys. If you have any memories of the system, or if you have any questions about it, if you're new to it, or if you have anything else you'd like to mention about the console, feel free to drop a comment down below and let me know, and I'll try to respond if I have the time. I should have the time. I don't do anything with myself except make videos, so yeah, I'll try to respond. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see me do this format with other game consoles, I have a couple of dozen retro consoles that I could do this with boxes and everything. So if you guys would like to see me do this more often, let me know and I'll consider it. Depending on how well this video does and how many people beg me to do more. But yeah, that's going to do it for me, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will actually have some cards in the corner here, right there, with you know, links to, say, my FM Towns Marty talking about the video. So if anyone wants to see that, that's an old one, but same format where I talk about the FM Towns Marty. But yeah, if you want to see more content like this, let me know. And that's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. And for everyone else already subbed, thank you for your continued support. And until the next one, take it easy.